Thank you for joining SchoolRubric's Educators Without Borders series. Today, promoting and maintaining health and wellness among faculty and support staff. Hosted by Wallace Ting of SchoolRubric with Julia Reynen, Daniel Gordon, and Sula Graham.
Hello everyone, it's Wallace from SchoolRubric, and we're super excited today to have a panel discussion on our first segment of Educators Without Borders. Today we're here to talk about maintaining health and wellness among faculty. So before we begin into our panel discussion, just a few points that we wanted to share about health and wellness in faculty and schools. The first thing is 78% of teachers report feeling physically and emotionally exhausted at the end of the day. So the majority of our teachers and our educators in schools around the world, they're tired, they're stressed, they're emotionally spent by the end of the day. And according to the study by the American Federation of Teachers, which came out in 2015, what are those biggest sources of teacher stress? Adoption of new initiatives without proper training, negative portrayal of educators in the media, uncertain job expectations, and salary. Another study that we found, 5% of teachers, in addition to the majority of teachers that report emotional stress, 5% of teachers suffer from long-lasting mental health problems. So one in every 20 teachers has a long-lasting mental problem, and that's actually a 5-fold increase from the last time the study was measured in the 1990s. This is an interesting graphic that I found and from a study called The State of America's Schools, The Path to Winning Again in Education. They found, of course, that student engagement was a key to student academic outcomes. And in fact, they found that a 1% increase in student engagement resulted in a 6-point increase in reading and an 8-point increase in math achievement. And as you can see from the diagram there, of course, there are many different facets in student engagement. And one of those key facets, in fact, is teacher engagement. And so going to the slide, well, how is teacher engagement related and why is teacher engagement so important? According to the study, teachers' engagement levels are directly related to those of their students and thereby to student achievement outcomes. Yet, nearly 70% of teachers are not engaged in their jobs. So how can we possibly expect for students to be engaged and students to learn if teachers aren't engaged and teachers aren't learning and they're stressed at their jobs? And so what are some solutions here? Mentoring and induction, having good programs for workplace wellness, helping teachers with social emotional learning, and providing mindfulness programs have been found to help reduce teacher stress. And so for that reason today, we have 3 educators with us from around the world to help shed some light and talk about some strategies that are working and to lend their experience and viewpoints. Today we have Julia Reynen, who's the founder and principal advisor of Culture Innovator from Toronto, Canada. She's a former international school teacher and principal in Indonesia, Panama, and Korea. She's currently started a new project, Clear Crossing Academy, which offers courses and support for professionals in leadership, culture, and storytelling. We also have with us Sula Graham, who is a leadership and management coach at WorkSpa Limited. She's based out of London in the UK. She also worked in inner city schools in the United Kingdom for 10 years and then overseas in Korea as the assistant head teacher of an international school. And then finally, we're pleased to have with us Daniel Gordon, who's the middle school principal at Saudi Arabia, Aramco Expatriate Schools. He's originally from Washington State in the United States, but he's been overseas for more than a decade in Saudi Arabia as both a high school and middle school principal. So folks, we want to welcome our panel today. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so let's jump into the first questions. We fielded questions from educators around the world. And our first question is from Tim Shirk, high school principal in Cali, Colombia.
Hello and good morning. The question that I have for our guest panel is, during distance learning, we have heard from many of our teachers, from our students, from our principals, that they are working more than ever. And here we are working from our homes. We have no commute to work. We have no commute home from work. We have the creature comforts of our home around us, yet we are all working more than ever. Why do you think that is? Why are we actually working even more now than we were before? Thank you.
Danny, what do you think?
Wallace, I think it's a great question, and we're all asking it. There are three things that come to mind immediately in terms of why we are working more, why we feel like we're working more. One is the learning curve is so steep in terms of changing the paradigm of how we teach and learn, how we provide instruction, how we provide assessment, how we provide feedback. We're learning new digital tools, and we're learning different tools to find out which is most efficient, most effective. Secondly, there's the implementation dip that goes along with all the new school tools and new skills that we're learning. It's one thing to know how to use them, and then it's another thing then to build our lesson design around them. And then finally, it's partly in the question where we are working from home, and there's no boundary between our work and our home life. Whereas our home life used to be where we'd have refuge from work. Now we've brought our work right into our living rooms, and we're tied by several devices to students sometimes across all sorts of time zones, replying to emails at all times of day, responding to students at all times of day, answering questions, giving feedback. So those are the three primary reasons that we really feel like, and we are working more than ever before.
Julia, any reactions to that?
Yeah, the second component that Danny brought up in terms of all of the new ways that we are doing things, not only through our implementation, but right through to assessment. I'm going to call this some sort of an emotional tax that we're taking on in trying to do so many new things all at once. It's absolutely exhausting and draining. And I think it's one of the things that's really leading us all to feel as though we're working more, longer, and harder than we had previously.
Excellent. Let's go right to the second question from Texas. We have Traci Browder.
Now, educators are husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, caregivers. Educators are students, teachers, professors, counselors, administrators. How do we find balance? How do we manage the stress? How do we support our colleagues? What gives? What stays? Where is the intentionality in taking care of ourselves and taking care of others?
Sula, any thoughts on that question from Traci?
Yeah, well, I thought really important question and quite a hard one to answer. I think one of the biggest issues that most educators face is finding work-life balance, probably even more in a time like this. What I will say is that it's really important to start with yourself, because you cannot care for everybody else if you're not looking after yourself. I think it's very easy to say, and it sounds, easier said than done, but it's something that's really important. And I would suggest carving out time. So even if that is switching off on a Saturday, switching off on the weekend if you can, and I know that's not the easiest thing for teachers to do, taking an hour on a Wednesday or a Thursday after school to do something for yourself before you think about anyone else, that is a really big priority, I think, because most teachers are already burnt out, they're exhausted, they're tired, because they are giving everywhere and they're not taking any time for themselves. So just scaling back a bit and taking time for ourselves, doing yoga, listening to music, anything that we love and enjoy will give us a bit more energy to do the other things that we need to do. I think another point is prioritizing what is the most important thing. And I think one of the key things is that our children are the most important thing. And I think in education, we come away from that. We have targets, we have paperwork, we have meetings, we have so many things. We forget that actually the students are the people that we are doing this for. So that needs to be the priority. So sometimes if other things need to be put aside for what the students need in that time, I think that that's really important, and that we need to come back to that a lot, because I think that's something that we can forget about sometimes.
Danny, I know in international schools, sometimes that work-life balance gets blurred even more. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, when you, especially in Saudi Arabia, where there may not be too much to do in the expatriate community, and that expatriate community is so closed. What are your thoughts?
Well, it really is about setting those boundaries for oneself. And as teachers, we're perfectionists, and there's always more we can do. There's always more feedback. There's always ways to enhance our lessons, our assessments. And, it's so important to really recognize what is important, what really fundamentally is important, that boils down to whether it's a learning objective or whether it's how you're going to spend the time you have in a day. But you're right, in the international schools, you tend to really live the work. It is what we live, and during this time, it's particularly important to stay focused on what is going to fill our buckets in addition, because we know what's empty in our buckets.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump right to the next question. We're going to shoot over right north of the border to Toronto, Canada, right down the street from Julia, from our next question from Pav Wander, who's the co-host of the Staff Room podcast and a middle school teacher.
Teachers and administrators are stretched so thin with their strenuous new teaching scenarios, whether they are face-to-face, virtual, or a hybrid of the two. How can administrators encourage their teachers to take time for self-care and wellness in the midst of all of this stress? And how can they model doing the same?
You know, I love this question because it's also about leadership and it's also about that modeling. So it's one thing to let teachers know that they should find that work-life balance, but as leaders as well, how do we model that? Julia, what are some of your thoughts?
Thanks, Wallace. Yeah, I'd like to start off by talking about the importance of modeling. So really, leaders being able to share their wellness journey with their staff and faculty is important. So whether that's, standing up in an all hands meeting or having it a regular part of your written communication, perhaps via newsletter, talking about things that you're doing for your own physical and mental wellness, like perhaps taking short walks, practicing meditation, perhaps having a gratitude practice or an affirmation practice every day. Maybe it's baking or cooking, or perhaps playing with your kids or learning new things at your own pace. All of those things are really important, and it's really symbolic when leaders share their journey with their staff and faculty to really add that human touch to who they are. And to help people understand that they're going through very similar life challenges as well. Beyond that, I would say sharing the idea with folks that it's okay to say no, and building in, I think we talked about boundaries earlier, building in the ability for people to be able to make decisions appropriately. It's okay to say no, and I think we as educators often will try to overcompensate as best we possibly can in order to say yes to absolutely everything, because usually we want to, but we do need to reserve ourselves sometimes. Beyond that, just really like fundamental things like reallocating budgets to support professional development for educators around health and wellness in the workplace. Just a few things that I can provide that are actually predominantly free of charge would be getting into the Smiling Mind community. That's actually something that myself, as well as previous faculties that I've worked with, have really benefited from tremendously, and it's really actually geared towards educators. It's a really cool initiative out of Australia. Something else that I would highlight as something that I've done in the past with employees is coordinating with HR and group benefits to really tease out to what extent can group benefits support aspects of health and wellness, such as massage therapy, such as talk therapy or counseling, and any other additional wellness budgets that you're able to leverage with your group coordinator will go a long way with faculty. And I would really, it's time well spent, absolutely. In addition to that, just continue to share the journey. Again, the more that we can share what's going on behind the scenes to support people will help people understand really where's the status, not only for ourselves, but for the institution as well.
Sula, I know you do a lot of work with leadership consultancy. I know you work with a lot of school leaders. What kind of advice do you have for school leaders on how to model the separation between work-life balance and also communicate that message to their staffs?
One of the key things I suggest, which may seem very simple, it's actually a very simple thing to implement, but is really important, is having it as a minute and meeting priority or in line management minutes. We have agendas where we want to tick off exam results and budget and all of these things, but we never put things like well-being or mental health as a priority on meeting agendas. whenever I've met with middle leaders or whenever I've been managing teams myself, I have that as one of my priorities. It's an actual check-in every week. How are you today? How are you feeling? How is your mental health? You know, what can we do to help and support you at this time? I think that senior teams should have that on their agenda and be focusing on how their staff are doing. It needs to be regular. If you're talking about it every single week, if you're, you know, it doesn't have to be loads of time, but if it's a priority every week, it's in everyone's minds all of the time. I think that is really, really important. Following on from what Julia said, the company that I've been working for, WorkSpa, they go into offices and they provide mindfulness, nutrition, they provide massage, yoga and things like that. And I think if workplaces, and I know we're not all working, you know, closely together yet, but when we get back to some form of normality, if workplaces can offer those simple things, even if it's once a week or on a Friday, some form of well-being for their staff, and senior management be involved in that, I think that's really important. I think, like Julia said, I don't think you should ever ask your team to do something that you won't do yourself as a senior leader. And I always encourage my senior leaders and middle leaders that I work with that they have to lead from example, and they have to be involved and show that it's important. And then everyone else, you know, it will trickle down and follow through.
Great. Let's go to our next question. We're going to Brazil, and we have a great question from a teacher who is transitioning into administration.
As a former teacher transitioning into the world of administration, what steps or tips might you have for implementing a wellness program with staff and students during this unique time of distance learning?
Danny, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, because I know you've been at a school administrator in both the middle school and high school for a long time. What are some of those pieces of advice that you might have for Christian as a new school administrator?
Well, one of the things we hear time and time again is how isolating the distance learning and teaching has been for people. So one of the tips is whatever structures you can build to keep your teachers connected with one another, to keep your students connected with one another, to keep your students connected with teachers, whatever can be done to break down those barriers of isolation and to keep people connected with one another is the first tip. One of the things we did here in Saudi Arabia at my school over the summertime, because we were all here together like many international educators, is we over 6 weeks, every Sunday, we work Sunday to Thursday. So every Sunday morning or Monday morning, we spend an hour in groups telling our stories. So each week we'd sit down with a slide, you know, different chapters of our story, whether it's birth to high school or how I became a teacher or trials and tribulations. That was one of the ways we reduced isolation throughout the summer. The second tip I would provide is whatever opportunity you can give teachers or anyone on your staff for input. The sense of efficacy right now is so low because control is so limited in what we can influence. So as we spent the summer again together preparing for the new school year, there were several opportunities for teachers to give feedback on the different plans we were making to revise our distance learning program, to build a hybrid model. Everything we created as a leadership team, we'd put out to our staff, solicit input and feedback from them, and it would all be incorporated so they would know they had a voice and it would be heard, and a lot of great ideas, and we have better results because we followed that process.
Sula, I'm going to dig into your consultancy and leadership experience again. Any reactions? Any thoughts?
I think that's key, actually. The most important thing, one of the most important things Danny said is about input. I think we ask a lot of questions, you know, let's get this on paper and let's make a list of all the targets of the things we're going to do. And actually, we just need to speak to our staff. We just need to ask them, what do they need? What do they want? You know, how can I help you with your well-being? Because we can come up with great ideas, but we may not be on the ground knowing what they're really going through. And that's what I normally tell a lot of leaders. Are you speaking to your staff? Are you just making assumptions that this is what they need? They may not want massage. They may want to finish half day on a Friday, or, you know, there's lots of different ways. So I think speaking to staff is so important. You can do that through surveys, you can do that through one-to-ones, but find out first what they want. And as soon as you implement something that someone has said they wanted, they feel empowered straight away. They feel listened to. The same way that children do when we engage them and involve them in, you know, the rules of their lesson or their learning. So I just think that is a key thing. And I think a lot of people, a lot of leaders and managers forget that. They think their job is to just make the rules and implement them, and they stop listening to staff. And people just want to be listened to more than anything else. But then what is really key is that we make sure we follow through on what they've asked for. We can't do everything, but you know, they don't just want to think you're listening. You need to implement those things and show the process of, okay, so next term we are going to give you an hour less, you know, you can finish a bit earlier, or we are going to implement what you've asked. And that alone is going to make people feel better, I think.
Julia, I'm going right over to you. New principal, been a teacher for a long time. You've been a principal before. You work with a lot of leaders as well. What are your thoughts?
Not to sound like a broken record, but honestly, the number one thing is you need to create multiple forms to receive feedback, and also allow there to be ample room to take action within the flexibility of a strategic plan on that feedback. It goes an awfully long way to empower and to create greater craftsmanship and efficacy amongst a faculty and staff when they actually see their thoughts, feelings, and opinions being applied to help solve problems, or perhaps to help curtail things from perhaps falling off the rails in the future. And again, like, we work with wildly just talented individuals who have a lot to give and share, and leaning into their knowledge, their expertise, and their thoughts, feelings, and opinions are going to go an awfully long way.
Love that piece about the multiple pieces of feedback. Sorry, go ahead.
No, can I just add one specific example that caps all three of what we're saying? Is that at the beginning of the summer, again, I asked my teachers a one-question survey. I said, what can I, as the principal, do this summer, because we're all here together, that's going to be supportive of our teachers? And overwhelmingly, this idea of building connections came back. And so that's where our My Story project came out of. So it's an example of what Julia and what Sula just said, is this idea that there was input solicited and then acted upon. And as a result, you know, the connections were built, community was built, and there was real, I firmly believe that the talent and skills that we have in our schools is just so awesome that leveraging it in any way we can is wellness, is going to promote wellness.
Let's jump straight to our next question. We have somebody from Switzerland who's the vice principal of an international school. Let's play the question.
As we start this new school year, we actually have a really long time with a lot of unpredictability ahead of us. And I definitely see a different mindset of our faculty this year. And what I'm wondering what other strategies there are to both support our faculty as well as our students' wellness and resilience more for the long term, and not necessarily the short term and just getting the school year up and running.
I'm hearing a lot of key words there: mindset, long-term, unpredictability. Julia, what are your thoughts? Sort this out for us.
I really want to tackle this with first establishing a working definition of resilience within your faculty and your school community. It could look and mean different things to different folks. So I think starting there, but really resilience is about being able to bounce back or rebound from tragic or traumatic incidences that are happening or continue to happen. But it's not about ignoring them. It's actually about acknowledging that this pain or this challenge exists and finding ways to move past it. And so ways to move past it, I'm going to go into really talking about strategic planning around professional development, not only this academic year, but really weaving it into the learning plan for the future of your faculty and staff. So really allocating budget and setting aside time and space to dig into building resilience and mindfulness together. I want to share a few resources that could be helpful in getting people started on their journey. There's some great open access material on the web right now through positivepsychology.com. They have a great starter kit called 3 Resilience Exercises. It leads into another sort of 17-step phase that you can go through by means of professional development. And this was curated particularly with educators in mind, which is kind of cool. Another resource that I want to point the audience towards is Dr. Kristen Neff's work in self-compassion. So you can find her at selfcompassion.org. She has a wide variety of online tools and resources, as well as she's authored and co-authored more than a dozen books at this point. And then of course, one of my favorites, Dr. Brene Brown, getting staff and faculty perhaps in tune with some of her TED Talks and online materials on shame, resilience, and vulnerability in the workplace, and really as an individual. And so those are a few starting points that I think that could be really useful to help really build resilience and mindfulness within the faculty and staff this academic year.
That's great. Danny, I'm going to turn to you. I know there's a lot of unpredictability. I know you've done a lot of work with your staff last year to kind of implement a solution to get over distance learning and to make sure that, people survive. But now as you look at the new school year, what are your thoughts on mindfulness, resilience, as more of a long-term basis in such an unpredictable time?
Yeah, I think that healing is an important concept that deserves some space in a community of learners when we come back together, because everyone has responded to COVID-19 and distance learning so differently, depending upon personal circumstances or family circumstances. And there needs to be time for people to tell their stories. There needs to be time for people to share with one another what their experiences were like, what they felt, what they thought as we progressed through it. I think that healing is so important to building resilience. And also, as the school leader, one of the important roles I've taken on is chief messenger in terms of constantly communicating. Even though I don't know anything, I don't know when the borders are going to open. I don't know when the flights are going to resume. I don't know when COVID-19 is going to go away, but I always communicated to my staff everything I did know. Even when I didn't know it, I would communicate that I'm waiting for information just like you. So I think resilience also is built into trusting one another. And, trust comes second after vulnerability. And as we heal and become vulnerable with one another, and as I was vulnerable and saying, I don't have the answers, but if I find out, I will let you know as soon as possible. Going forward, that's that people can rely on that. They can look back and they can count on that. And that's when everything is so uncertain, knowing what you can rely on is so incredibly important.
Sula, any thoughts, reactions?
Yeah, I'd like to speak a bit about students, because I think she mentioned long-term for students as well as staff. I think for students, we have to teach them resilience. We make assumptions that they're just going to have it, and they're not. And where that comes in is your PHSE or PSD curriculum, your social skills curriculum, doing lessons on resilience, having time, like Danny said, having time for staff to be able to talk about what they've been through. Children have been as terrified in this time. They may have lost loved ones, they would be as scared. They may not communicate it in the same way, but giving space for those children to talk about how they feel and what they're going through with adults and with each other, and actually teaching, doing lessons around being resilient, how to bounce back, how to get through stress. I think that should be taught anyway, but I think students are going to need that more than ever right now.
Great. Let's move right on to our next question. We have a chief questioner from Socrates Head of School, Mark Engstrom. Let's play the question.
Mark Engstrom, Chief Questioner, Socrates Head of School. Mindfulness question. How do you balance the expectation of rigor with all that research says is best about deep student learning?
I love this question because there's always an assumption that when you're focusing on resilience and you're focusing on soft skills and you're focusing on health and wellness, that sometimes you're neglecting the time that you need to establish student academic outcomes. Danny, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I don't, in this question, see that necessarily rigor and deep student learning are in opposition, and they go hand in hand. And when one of the keys to it is, making sure there's real clarity. So clarity in terms of the curriculum, whether it's the power standards or the essential understandings, that there's the recognition that distance learning does provide an opportunity for us to really dig deeply into what are the most essential learnings and what's the structure, the essential power standards we need our kids to learn. And when we have a staff that is supported and a staff that understands that they have structures in place to help them, then they're going to be able to focus more of their energy on what's absolutely essential. The expression that we've talked about here in our international region is this idea of we want to accelerate, not remediate. In other words, and I think that comes from Education Week, where this idea is we can't go back and backfill everything that was missed as a result of this interruption. But what we can do is we can really focus on the essentials to move students forward to make sure they keep abreast with where they are in terms of grade level. And what we've talked about earlier in terms of social emotional learning for the students, so that they have the capacity to be able to both learn deeply in a rigorous environment that isn't overwhelming to them. So I don't see rigor and deeper learning in opposition to one another here. This idea of just more and more and more isn't necessarily my idea of rigor, and I wouldn't recommend it for anyone at this point.
I'm going to kick it over to Julia. Any thoughts, reactions? Do you agree? Do you don't agree?
I'm in Danny's camp on this one. In terms of, and I want to tackle really the importance of clarity, finding multiple ways to cascade communication around clear expectations and be clear on what it is that you're focused on, but also what it is that you're saying goodbye to. What is it that we're no longer going to create noise in the system about, but what are the handful of perhaps power standards in this case that we're really going to dig into and execute on throughout the semester or academic year, depending on the nature of the course. And that goes also to supporting teachers in effectively communicating expectations around academic rigor is that if you, as perhaps the curriculum coordinator or the leader of a division or even the leader of a school in certain cases, can clearly articulate what are the exact standards that we're looking at getting at this academic year, and very clearly identifying what we're not doing, that's gonna create a whole lot of calm in the system, I think.
All right, let's go to our final question from Boulder, Colorado, a school librarian. Let's play the question.
Hi, my name is Mallory Goetz, and I work for 2 school districts in Colorado in the United States. So I am really wondering about how districts can change that and make it truly more of a priority for their staff and faculty to be able to focus and take time for themselves and really take a minute and think about, how am I doing today? Do I need to seek support? How do I know I need to seek support? Those kinds of things. And how do you make that more of a priority and less of something in a giant email that's sent out to your entire district of staff and faculty? I'd really love to hear your ideas and thank you for discussing this.
So this is a super interesting question because I know it seems like this question is centered around a district or a school's intentionality and whether or not it seems like they're doing this to do a rubber stamp or that they really mean to do this and they really mean to do well and care about their teachers. Sula, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to give some tips on how schools, senior teams, middle leaders can make it a priority. So it's there all the time. They're thinking about it all the time. I want to come back to what I spoke about it being part of line management meetings, it being part of action plans, it being part of your long-term plans. It needs to be a subject, just like budgeting, just like curriculum, just like results. We have to have it as a priority. It needs to be planned, it needs to be spoken about. I think there's a number of different techniques and things we can do. I think something that's really important is having well-being days, or in your, when you have your inset days, we call them inset days in the UK, you might have, training days for staff. You have a section for well-being where you might bring someone in to support them and help them. I think we need to review workloads and work hours. Like there needs to be a review of those things. And I think it's about being proactive. I think a really important thing to do, and I know the whole year is stressful for teachers, but I think a really important thing to do for senior team is to review the year and review the times in the year that are most stressful. So when exams are coming up, always the last 2 weeks before half term and holidays, where everyone is on the brink of, really being stressed out, children are exhausted and staff, and find out things and techniques that can be used around those times to support staff. Because we're all trying to get to the end, not thinking about the fact that people need more support then than ever. So finding times in the year that you need to help and support your staff the most, and then bringing in a number of the things that we've spoken to support them.
Danny, I want to turn to you a little bit, because I think the question also is about, what if my school district doesn't get it? What if my school leader doesn't get it? So how would they be compelled to act and make these line of budget items, to make these surveys, to reach out, to formulate plans, if they don't even understand perhaps it's a problem? What are your thoughts on that, Danny?
The key to understanding the problem is actually asking the questions and listening. And to the extent that, that's happening, then they can be responsive to it. And if they're not asking the questions and they're not listening, then it's gonna be a significant challenge today and tomorrow in the future. So in terms of, if the district's not responding, then, teachers need to continue to communicate their needs in terms of the specific support that they need, whether it's the upskilling in areas to deliver the distance learning, whether it's the safety concerns they have about to the extent they're back in school, whether it's the needs they have to meet and be informed and communicate. The advocacy and the self-advocacy is also a part of being well. And I would encourage and insist that really people continue to advocate for themselves and with their colleagues in the hallway or in the building, so that they really can take care of one another in the absence of care from somewhere else, or until the care comes from the bigger institution or organization.
Julia, any reaction?
Yeah, I would say I would want to end on a note, again, on the empowerment piece and the self-advocacy piece. We're all in vastly different situations, depending on if we work in a private international system, perhaps a blended private-public, or perhaps a public or private sort of local school, depending. And so there's going to be different levels of support for faculty who feel as though health and wellness is falling through the cracks. One thing that I really want to share with people today is the ability to tap into perhaps your union, perhaps tap into your faculty representation group. A lot of international schools would have a faculty rep who might have a seat on the board, or perhaps direct communication with the board of directors. Some sort of like tapping into some sort of line of leadership to let folks know who are leading the charge that they're missing the mark on this. I think one of the aspects that Mallory was getting at is, well, what do we do if my leader or if my school or my board is missing the mark? And I think really empowering teachers that they do have a voice in the matter, and that there are various outlets depending on your situation. I think that can be really helpful for people who might not know.
All right, I think that's a good place for us to end it. Really want to thank our three expert panelists today, Danny, Sula, and Julia, for being with us today and sharing their expertise and knowledge in our first rendition of Educators Without Borders. Folks, thanks so much for being with us today.